November 8, 1942, the beaches of Fadala, Morocco, Operation Torch. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Crawford stands knee-deep in the surf, shouting. His voice is lost in the roar of diesel engines and the concussive thump of French coastal artillery. Around him, the first major American amphibious assault of the European theater is turning into chaos. Crawford watches helplessly as light tanks from the 2nd Armored Division lurch onto the sand. They are blind. They are deaf. The tank commanders are popping their hatches, frantically waving signal flags, colored pieces of cloth, in a modern mechanized war. A sniper's bullet or a stray piece of shrapnel is all it takes to silence that communication. Crawford grabs the heavy, backpack-sized radio set strapped to his signalman. It's the SCR-300, colloquially known as the walkie-talkie. It's a miracle of engineering, but right now, it's useless. The salt spray has soaked the connections. The heavy batteries are draining fast. The signal is garbled by the interference of hundreds of engines. He needs to tell the lead tank to pivot left, to flank a machine gun nest pinning down the infantry. He screams into the handset. Static, just static. The tank pivots right, straight into the line of fire of a 75 mm anti-tank gun. The explosion is immediate. The turret shears off. 3 American tankers are incinerated in seconds. Crawford lowers the handset. This wasn't a failure of courage. It wasn't a failure of firepower. It was a failure of communication. In 1942, the United States Army, the most rapidly industrializing force on the planet, was trying to coordinate a blitzkrieg with hand signals and shouting. Men were dying because their voices couldn't travel further than a scream. This is the documented story of how a small Chicago company called Galvin Manufacturing, later known to the world as Motorola, took on the impossible task of miniaturizing the radio. It is the story of how they shrank a room full of vacuum tubes into a device you could hold in one hand, broke the laws of physics as they were understood at the time, and gave the Allied soldier the one weapon the enemy could not match, a voice that could cut through the fog of war. To understand why Lieutenant Colonel Crawford's radio failed him on that beach in Morocco, we have to look at the terrifying reality of American military communications in early 1942. The United States was preparing to fight a war on 2 fronts spanning 10,000 miles. Yet, the doctrine of the U.S. Signal Corps was stuck in 1918. Their reliance was on field telephones, literal copper wires that had to be physically spooled out across battlefields by brave men sprinting under fire. If an artillery shell cut the wire, the line went dead. If a tank ran over the wire, the line went dead. Wireless options existed, but they were cumbersome beasts. The standard vehicle radio, the SCR-245, weighed over 200 pounds. It required a massive vehicular power supply. If you were an infantryman on foot or a paratrooper dropping behind enemy lines, you were electronically isolated the moment you hit the ground. The strategic crisis was absolute. The German Wehrmacht had pioneered the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, fueled by ubiquitous radio communication. Every panzer had a radio. Every Stuka dive bomber could talk to the ground. They moved with a fluidity that American observers watched with horror during the invasion of France in 1940. The American vulnerability was quantifiable. In 1941, 85% of U.S. Army tactical communication below the battalion level still relied on runners, visual signals, or wire. But there was a deeper, materials-based crisis lurking beneath the tactical one. Radio technology depended on vacuum tubes, glass bulbs containing delicate filaments. These tubes were fragile, heat-generating, and power-hungry. To make a radio portable, you needed batteries. But batteries in 1942 were heavy lead, acid monstrosities or short-lived dry cells that lost their charge in humidity. America depended on 90% of its natural rubber from Southeast Asia, a supply line severed by the Japanese Empire within weeks of Pearl Harbor. Without rubber for insulation and seals, radios failed in the jungle dampness of the Pacific. Without high-grade quartz crystals from Brazil for frequency stabilization, radios drifted off-channel, becoming useless noise boxes. The Army calculated that without a reliable, portable, man-carried radio, Infantry casualty rates in the upcoming invasions would be 30% to 40% higher. They needed a radio that weighed less than 6 pounds, could operate with one hand, and was rugged enough to survive a parachute drop. Standard military contractors like RCA and Western Electric said it was physically impossible. The vacuum tubes didn't exist. The batteries didn't exist. The circuitry couldn't be compressed that small. They were right. The technology didn't exist. Someone would have to invent it from scratch. Enter Paul Galvin. Born in Harvard, Illinois in 1895, Galvin was not an engineer. He was a visionary with a stubborn streak that bordered on recklessness. He had failed in the storage battery business twice. He had gone bankrupt, lost his home, and at one point had $1.65 to his name. But in 1928, he and his brother Joe founded Galvin Manufacturing Corporation in Chicago. They didn't start with military contracts. They started with car radios. At the time, putting a radio in a car was considered dangerous and technically unfeasible due to engine interference. Galvin solved it. He branded his car radio Motorola, a portmanteau of motor and Victrola. But the genius behind the technical wizardry wasn't Paul. It was a soft-spoken, brilliant engineer named Don Mitchell. Mitchell was the kind of engineer who saw problems as personal insults. In 1940, watching the war consume Europe, Mitchell had a realization. He looked at the massive backpack radios the Army was testing, the early walkie-talkies, and shook his head. They were FM units, back-mounted, weighing 35 pounds. You couldn't shoot a rifle while holding one. You couldn't crawl through mud with one. Paul Galvin, sensing the coming storm, had sent Mitchell to observe the National Guard maneuvers in Wisconsin in late 1940. What Mitchell saw appalled him. Soldiers were using flags. They were shouting. They were getting killed by umpires because they couldn't call for support. Mitchell returned to Chicago and told Galvin, they don't need a backpack. They need something they can hold like a telephone handset. Something self-contained. Galvin, the businessman, asked if the Army had requested such a device. Mitchell replied, no, they don't know it's possible. This was the pivotal moment. The U.S. Signal Corps had not asked for a handheld radio. In fact, their specifications explicitly stated that portable radios must be backpack-mounted for battery capacity. Galvin Manufacturing was a small fish compared to the whales of General Electric and Westinghouse. They couldn't afford to develop a product the Army hadn't asked for. It was a massive financial risk. But Paul Galvin remembered World War I. He had served in the artillery in France. He remembered the silence of the front line when the wires were cut. He remembered the feeling of isolation. Build it, Galvin said. We'll show them what they need. Mitchell gathered a small team of engineers, men like Ray Yoder and Jack Davis. They set up shop in a corner of the factory on West Harrison Street in Chicago. They weren't just building a radio, they were attempting to miniaturize the entire architecture of electronic communication. The device Don Mitchell envisioned was the SCR-536, later immortalized as the Handie-Talkie. The technical challenges were not merely difficult, they were contradictions. First, the size. The entire unit, transmitter, receiver, antenna, and power supply had to fit into a housing roughly 12 inches long and 3 inches wide. It had to weigh under 6 pounds. This required a radical rethink of component density. A standard radio of the time used vacuum tubes the size of light bulbs. Mitchell's team sourced the newest, peanut tubes, tiny glass cylinders barely an inch tall. But these tubes generated heat. In a large cabinet, air circulation cooled them. Inside a sealed, waterproof metal shell, that heat would cook the capacitors and melt the wax insulation. Mitchell's solution was elegant and risky. He designed the chassis as a heat sink, dissipating the thermal energy through the metal casing itself into the soldier's hand. Second, the antenna. A standard antenna for the frequencies they needed should have been 8 feet long. A soldier couldn't run with an 8-foot pole. Mitchell developed a telescoping ribbon antenna that collapsed into the body of the radio. But shrinking the antenna meant shrinking the range. The physics were inescapable. To compensate, the receiver had to be incredibly sensitive. The team designed a superheterodyne circuit, a complex method of mixing frequencies to amplify the signal that was squeezed into a space the size of a cigarette pack. They used 45 separate components in that tiny space. Resistors, capacitors, and coils were soldered with surgical precision. Then came the switch problem. How do you turn it on? In combat, fumbling for a switch could mean death. Mitchell designed a mechanism where simply extending the antenna turned the radio on. Collapsing it turned it off. It was intuitive. It was soldier-proof. But the biggest hurdle was the batteries. To get the required voltage in such a small space, they couldn't use standard cells. Galvin's chemists had to work with battery manufacturers like Burgess to create a high-density dry cell block specifically for this chassis. The testing phase was brutal. They didn't just test for reception, they tested for survival. They took prototypes to the roof of the Chicago factory and threw them onto the concrete pavement 3 stories below. They submerged them in tanks of water to simulate jungle river crossings. They put them in freezers at 40 degrees Fahrenheit to simulate high-altitude drops. The early prototypes failed. The glass tubes shattered on impact. The water seals leaked, shorting out the high-voltage circuit. They tried again. They potted the delicate components in beeswax and tar to shock-proof them. They redesigned the casing with die-cast aluminum instead of stamped steel for rigidity. In early 1941, Mitchell took the prototype to Washington, D.C. He walked into the office of Colonel R.V.D. Corput, the director of the Signal Corps Laboratories. He didn't have an appointment. He didn't have a contract. He pulled the device out of his briefcase. It looked like a large, rectangular telephone handset painted olive drab. He extended the antenna. He handed another unit to the colonel's aide and told him to walk down the hall. "Talk," Mitchell said. The colonel held the device to his ear. Through 2 stone walls and 50 feet of hallway, the aide's voice came through crisp and clear. Colonel Corput looked at the device. It weighed 5 pounds. It was battery-operated. It was wireless. "How many can you make?" he asked. The order came down: build thousands, and build them yesterday. Galvin Manufacturing had never mass-produced precision military electronics on this scale. They were a car radio company. Now they had to transform into a defense contractor overnight. The scale-up crisis began in the spring of 1942. The factory on West Harrison Street was already bursting at the seams. They needed space. They needed materials. Most importantly, they needed people. The draft was stripping the factory of its male workforce. Skilled technicians, men who knew how to solder delicate circuits and align frequencies, were being shipped off to boot camps. Galvin turned to a new workforce: women. By late 1942, the assembly lines at Galvin were dominated by women, housewives, students, grandmothers. They came from Chicago's diverse neighborhoods, Polish immigrants from the North Side, African Americans from the South Side. Training was the bottleneck. Soldering a connection in a car radio allowed for a margin of error. Soldering the internals of an SCR-536 required the steadiness of a watchmaker. A single, cold solder joint, where the metal didn't bond perfectly, would vibrate loose in the back of a bouncing Jeep, rendering the radio dead. Galvin instituted a rigorous training program. They broke the assembly process down into minute, repeatable steps. One woman would place a specific capacitor. The next would apply the flux. The next would apply the solder. The next would inspect the joint with a magnifying glass. Then came the material shortages. Copper was rationed. Aluminum was prioritized for aircraft. The specific type of high-impact plastic needed for the mouthpiece was in short supply. The procurement team at Galvin became scavengers. When they couldn't get aluminum for the die-cast housing, they re-engineered the molds to use a zinc alloy that was more available, though heavier. When rubber for the gaskets ran out, they developed a synthetic neoprene seal that actually performed better in oil and gas environments. The production numbers tell the story of this desperate acceleration. In January 1942, they produced fewer than 500 units. By June 1942, as the Battle of Midway raged, they were pushing out 3,000 units a month. By November 1942, coincident with Operation Torch, That number had climbed to 500 units per month. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The air inside was thick with the smell of rosin flux and ozone. The noise was a constant hum of ventilation fans and the rhythmic, thunk hiss of pneumatic screwdrivers. There was no margin for error. Every radio was tested in a screen room, a copper-lined cage that blocked out all external radio waves. If a unit failed the frequency check, it wasn't discarded. It was dissected to find the flaw. The pressure on the workers was immense. They knew what they were building. Signs hung above the assembly lines. "Th soll die Slufeisen your Hennets." This wasn't propaganda. It was the literal truth. The true test came not in a laboratory, but in the hell of combat. November 1943. Tarawa Atoll, the Pacific Theater. The Marines were wading into the lagoon under withering Japanese machine gun fire. The water was red with blood. The confusion was total. The landing craft vehicles were getting hung up on the coral reef hundreds of yards from shore. In the chaos, the heavy backpack radios were often lost, drowned in the salt water, or abandoned by men struggling simply to keep their heads above water. But the SCR-536 Handie-Talkies were clipped to the webbing of platoon leaders. They were sealed. They were light. Marine Lieutenant William Dean found himself pinned down behind a seawall of coconut logs. His platoon was separated. He couldn't see his flank. In any previous war, he would have been isolated, forced to make a blind decision. Instead, he pulled the SCR-536 from his belt, extended the antenna, and pressed the talk switch. "Blue 2. This is Blue 6. Report location." The voice of his sergeant, pinned down 50 yards to the left, crackled back. "Blue 6, we have a pillbox at 2 o'clock. Taking heavy fire. Hold fast, Blue 2. I'm calling in mortars." That simple exchange, seconds of conversation, changed the geometry of the battle. Dean was able to coordinate fire on the pillbox without exposing himself to visual signals. On the other side of the world, in the hedgerows of Normandy in June 1944, the Handie-Talkie was changing the nature of infantry combat. The hedgerows, ancient earthen walls covered in thick vegetation, were perfect defensive positions for the Germans. An American tank couldn't see through them. An infantryman couldn't shoot through them. But with the SCR-536, a scout could crawl forward, peer through a gap in the hedge, spot a German anti-tank gun, and whisper the coordinates back to a Sherman tank waiting safely behind the next hedgerow. The tank could then fire over the hedge using high, explosive shells, guided by the eyes of the infantryman. This was the tank-infantry team concept finally realized. Captured German intelligence reports from 1944 revealed a deep frustration with American communications. One Wehrmacht officer wrote, "The Americans act with a coordination that is baffling. We suppress them in one sector, and they immediately flank us in another, as if they are all sharing the same brain." They weren't sharing a brain. They were sharing a frequency. The Handie-Talkie had its limitations. Its range was short, about 1 mile over land, maybe 3 over water. The batteries died quickly if you talked too much. But it was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. It democratized command and control, pushing the ability to make decisions down to the lowest level of leadership, the sergeant and the lieutenant. By VJ Day in August 1945, the statistics of Galvan Manufacturing's contribution were staggering. The company had produced over 130,000 units of the SCR-536 Handie-Talkie. They had also produced nearly 50,000 units of the larger, backpack-mounted SCR-300 walkie-talkie. An SCR-536 in 1942 was roughly $175 per unit, about $200 in today's money. It was expensive, but the return on investment was incalculable. Military historians estimate that the improved coordination provided by these radios reduced preventable casualties by at least 15% in the European theater alone. That translates to tens of thousands of men who came home because a warning was shouted over a radio wave instead of lost in the wind. But the legacy extends far beyond the casualty lists. The technology developed by Don Mitchell and his team at Motorola fundamentally broke the barrier between portable and powerful. Before the SCR-536, a radio was a piece of furniture. After the SCR-536, a radio was a personal accessory. The miniaturization techniques, the dense packing of components, the heat management, the ruggedization, laid the direct groundwork for the consumer electronics revolution of the 1950s. The printed circuit boards that would appear a decade later were born from the frustration of hand soldering those 45 components into the Handie-Talkie. In the Korean War, the SCR-536 was still in use, serving alongside newer models. By Vietnam, the technology had evolved into transistorized units, lighter and more powerful, but the form factor, the handset held to the ear, remained the archetype. Galvin Manufacturing formally changed its name to Motorola Inc. in 1947, acknowledging that the brand had become bigger than the family name. They would go on to invent the pager, the dynamo behind the cellular network, and eventually, the cell phone itself. When Martin Cooper, a Motorola engineer, made the first public call from a handheld mobile phone in 1973, he was holding the great-grandchild of the SCR-536. The lineage is direct. The DNA is identical. Let's go back to Lieutenant Colonel Crawford, who we left on that beach in Morocco in 1942. He survived Operation Torch, and as the war progressed, he saw the transformation with his own eyes. 2 years later, crossing the Rhine into Germany, he watched a different army. He saw tank commanders talking to infantry squads. He saw artillery observers calling in steel rain with pinpoint accuracy using handheld devices. He saw an army that moved like a singular organism, connected by invisible nerves of radio waves. The irony of the Handie-Talkie story is that the U.S. Army never asked for it. They didn't think it was possible. It took a car radio manufacturer from Chicago, a company that made entertainment devices, to solve the most lethal problem of modern warfare. It reveals a fundamental truth about American industrial capacity during the war. It wasn't just about pouring steel and rubber into factories. It was about imagination. It was about the audacity to look at the laws of physics and say, we can bend them. Don Mitchell, Paul Galvin, and the thousands of women on the assembly lines in Chicago didn't just build a radio. They built a lifeline. Today, every time you pull a smartphone from your pocket, every time you see a first responder speaking into a shoulder microphone, every time you connect effortlessly with someone on the other side of the world, you are holding the legacy of 1942. You are using technology born from the desperate need to save a tank crew on a burning beach. You are benefiting from the ingenuity that ensured when freedom needed to speak, its voice would be heard.